I reviewed my life. Chapter 1, First Encounter. As we worked, Amy asked, "Tell us how you figured all this out." Okay, so now from my perspective, I'm going to tell you everything I can that is relevant that I have learned and witnessed to make you believe we can do this. Also, so that you may know and understand the risks to you physically and possibly spiritually, and little by little it will all add up. I will tell you everything because there are principalities at work here too, both good and evil. One day, a friend of mine, Randy from my Army days, called me and asked me if I wanted to work with him out west in Southern California. During that conversation, he said he would teach me how to drive a semi and put me to work. Since USS Steel laid me off forever, I had nothing to lose. I did learn a lot from several trades such as millwrighter, pipe fitter, and many other labor-based trades in Indiana as I grew up. I was soon traveling with him across the Southwest, delivering and picking up straw and hay as a hay hauler's helper. That job gave me lots of time to think. As I drove, I thought a lot about the things that I had done and gone through earlier in my life. One day, as I thought about my life, it occurred to me, in my life, there were good times, bad times, and strange times. I found myself reviewing memories which I had dismissed or completely forgotten about long ago. I did this to keep awake as I drove. At night, I would let my memory wander as far back as I could, and I found I remembered quite a bit from the age of 1 until present. I didn't relate these things to Randy. He seemed uninterested in such talk. Usually, I only did this as I drove and he slept. I practiced this technique frequently. It helped to keep me alert. One night, while driving back to California, right before we were to go on a vacation, a meteorite passed close, straight down in front of us and off to the right side of the road. It was 50 yards to the right and about 400 feet ahead of us. It must have impacted the ground because I see the light from it go that far. As I drove by its trajectory and path of impact, the smell of ozone in the air set off memories that sent me spiraling back in time. For some reason, it reminded me of a conversation I had with my mother at the age of 17. This was the start of the change in my life. When I was 17, I had a dream of an incident that happened when I was about 4 or 5 years old. That morning during breakfast, I asked my mother to tell me about the day that I dreamt about that night, and when she did, everything started to fall into place about that memory. It was such a strange day as I recall. She hesitated at first, but I convinced her to relate the missing pieces of my memory. I told her my dream the way I remembered it. I told her that I knew it was a strange day, a Twilight Zone kind of a day. She decided to open up to me, and I think it was time now for her to do so because of my age and because watching all the strange sci-fi and weird news events we were exposed to just from TV made it finally acceptable. Maybe she thought it might be something we needed to reanalyze because she had to wonder about that day also. Now I wanted to know the rest of what happened on that day in 1958/59. I would have been about 5 then. I remember asking my parents that day what it was they seemed so mesmerized by. I remembered the loud voices. This is what drew me to the back porch from playing indoors. The voices of the dream rang out loud in my mind. This triggered vivid visions in my memory of that day that didn't make sense. My parents seemed to ignore me as they spoke to each other in German that day, which I did not know or understand. They spoke to me mostly in Serbian and French. I was just starting to learn English. What I remember was that I could see out the knothole in the wood under the windows on the back porch facing the alley. The knothole was at the perfect height. Through that perspective, I could get my own answers. As I peered out the knothole, I could only see what was taking place on the ground in the alley. This was a second-story house we lived in. The angle of the knothole was set in such a way by chance placement of the board that its line of sight was pointing downward. As I recall, there were 2 patrol cars and a large number of people standing around the police cars. The police and everyone else were looking up at the sky while one Gary policeman had a megaphone that he was speaking through, hence the loud voice I remembered. It was what he was saying that stuck in my mind and came out in my dream. He repeated this: "You're in violation of city airspace, bring your craft down." That sentence didn't register back then since I didn't know the language very well at the time. In my dream, it did make sense, hence my curiosity, because I knew I dreamed of a real past event. The cops did this repeatedly for quite some time, and the volume of it ingrained into my memory as I remembered it in that dream. This is what I dreamt about, and it was so vivid I had to ask her what that was all about. I knew this was an event that I witnessed while I was awake as a child years before. I asked her exactly like this: "Mom, on the back porch when we lived on Jefferson Street, what was going on in the alley? Do you remember that day?" I had to jog her memory some, and it finally clicked after lots of talk of the different times and streets we lived on. I continued. "I asked you to lift me up so I could see outside into the alley, but at the time you refused to do so. Remember?" I said. "No," was her very first response. Then I asked, "Mom, do you remember the house we lived in when I was about 5, maybe 4? She wasn't sure. "Which house?" "The one on Jefferson Street," I said. There was a slight hesitation. "How did you remember that?" she finally asked, as it suddenly clicked for her. I then repeated to her what I have told you. She repeated exactly what I have said about what I knew about that day, and she told me the rest, exactly all the details of what was going on that day, which I had no idea of, which then made more sense to me as she explained it, at least somewhat now. If sense is the right word, it made me even more curious. They wouldn't tell me what it was they were looking at that day and what the police were doing, talking at the sky, but now she opened up. My parents were protective about what they were seeing that day with their old world ways and customs, but now she revealed it to me. I told her more. "I remember Pop saying to you, basically, take him inside," in Serbian, which I did understand. But as I remember, neither one of you could move. You seemed mesmerized. Carl asked, "So what did you do?" "Well, they kept telling me to go inside, but I was persistent and refused to leave. I outmaneuvered their attempts at capture when that became their effort, so they turned their energies to psychology while trying to protect me from seeing by telling me to go and hide in the house. They convinced me that they were helping to hide me out. It was the old cops are after you trick, which worked immediately to serve their purpose. So I ran into the house and hid for a time, even though I had no real idea what the cops were actually doing or the fact that they would have already captured such a young criminal easily. Everyone got the joke and laughed. Then John said, "Yeah, my parents used that one too, on me too." A couple of the others agreed and said the same. Amy then added and said, "Yes, and there was also the standard answer to the question of, where do I come from?" The answer from my parents was, "We found a dirty-faced kid in a garbage can, so they took me home and cleaned me up and kept me." It was such a shocking answer that as a child you never follow up on it, at least not for a while. It got repeated a couple of more times until I finally was told the truth. Everyone laughed and agreed, then encouraged me to continue. Well, after hearing that, I went in and hid for a while and soon quickly went back into play mode, and I gave no more thought to the weirdness out back until I dreamed about it at the age of 17. "What did she say?" Amy asked eagerly. "She told me what she knew. Her memory and mine matched up perfectly, up to my recollection. Then she completed the story for me after I went to hide. She described the incident and said, a white ball of light, solid looking, was hovering about 700 feet or so above the alley. She hesitated as she thought and said, it was silent and totally stationary, 30 to 40 feet across. It was at this time near the end of the incident that you turned and ran into the house to hide." "I remember doing that," I said. She said, "I heard that there was a call sent to the Gary airport for a plane to observe a shining object in the sky over the city. It was being broadcast live on the radio. Meanwhile, at that time, they had a Nike missile base next to and near the Gary airport. They obviously had radar at the time," she then added. "Eventually, a plane got there, circled it a few times, then all of a sudden the object shot straight up at an incredible speed and was gone in a flash or a streak of light. This whole incident had been going on for quite a duration of time till then. The radio stations were reporting it on the air live as it happened. It was news back then, but then we heard nothing on the news that night or afterward about it, which was strange." "The crowds looking up were bigger than I thought," I said. She said the whole city was aware of the UFO. "We then figured it happened in the spring-summer of 1958 to 59. This is as exact as we can be." And I then left for school. I kept hearing reports of different sightings throughout my teen years. It was at this time, at the age of 17, after hearing what she told me, that I started to read all I could for a year or two about the subject of unidentified unknowns or UFOs. We were all exposed to the investigative reports, from Project Blue Book to the Roswell incident, and even TV, radio, media. The reports or documentaries educated all of us to an event on what the first, second, third, and fourth encounters were in definition. After hearing that story from her and reading about the phenomena, I always wanted to see a real UFO, but that seemed unlikely, and I soon lost interest again, until I reached the age of 23 or thereabout. Suddenly, the subject and the phenomena of UFOs appeared when least expected, as I would find out while in the Army. What I was most impressed by was, even back then, how badly scientists wanted to know how they accomplished their flight, wanted to know the science behind the machine, the unknown physics, even though the government kept denying it all while the media seemed to ridicule it by joking about it. This made me curious at this time in my life again even more. Next, Chapter 2, Something Awakens Me.